This video is sponsored by Card Kingdom. If you click on the link in the description below, it'll take you to their store and they'll know I sent you there. Hi everyone, I'm Nitsa Honan. Today I'm bringing you a bonus video. Once a limited format is over, I like to go back and look at my predictions for the format before actually playing with it, and see where I was wrong, and then think about why I got it wrong, and that's what I'm doing in this video for Core Set 2021. I'm going to talk about all the cards that I was significantly wrong about, and that means I was wrong by more than half a letter grade. Ikoria was a set where I got a whole lot wrong, so it's nice that Core Set 2021 is a set where I didn't mess up too badly, which I guess isn't too surprising, given that it is a core set. I'll be looking at 10 cards in this video, 1 in white, 2 in blue, 6 in black, and 1 colorless card. While I think I did a good job overall in this set, I did have a lot of misses in black. Alright, let's look at the first card. The first card I want to look at is Siege Striker, which I gave a C- to. So overall, I didn't love this card, mostly just because it was so easy to kill, and I envisioned it happening where you would attack with it, tap down a bunch of stuff, and then your opponent kills it, and that does happen, and that is a real downside. But I think the upside ended up being worth it in this set. It just gets to be quite large. There are enough ways to augment your creatures in Core Set 2021 as well, that even if you're not tapping other creatures, you can make this large enough that it's a real problem. Frequently, you attack with it and your opponent has to block because it can do lethal. So it did end up having significant downside, but overall, I think it was better than I gave it credit for. Still not something you want to first pick, but a much more than just barely filler kind of card. Instead, it gets kind of close to being a little bit more than filler. I'm giving it a C+. Next up, it's Library Larcenist, which I gave a D+ to. This is one that a lot of people in the comments said I was going to get wrong, and usually there's a few cards that people say I'm going to get wrong in the comments. That ends up being the case, and that is the case here. I didn't like this for kind of similar reasons to Siege Striker. I saw it as having really inefficient stats, being killable by just about everything, and not being a very good attacker. And while all of that was true, to some extent, there were enough ways to bounce your opponent's creatures, to give this flying, to get it really going, and drawing you extra cards that ended up being a lot better than a D+. I mean, a D+ is a card you hope you don't have to play, and in the end, it ended up being a solid playable. It's still not amazing or anything, but putting Rousing Read on this or something like that is just crazy, and it ended up being a very playable card, one that I played pretty often in this format. Next up, it's Teferi's Tutelage. So this is a card in my set review that I recognized that this was a powerful mill engine, and I was like, this is legit. Sometimes we see mill engines and they're not very good, and you don't really want to play them, and those frequently get Ds or Fs. I gave this one a C+, but it was even better than I imagined it would be. This format has lots and lots of ways to draw multiple cards. You can rapidly mill your opponent out with all of these commons and uncommons that draw you extra cards. And this ended up being a very legitimate win condition for more controlling decks in this format. And some of my most successful decks in the format were Teferi's Tutelage decks. They're just very powerful. Obviously, you do need to end up with enough ways to stall the game and enough ways to draw extra cards, but that was pretty easy to do, generally speaking. And if you saw Teferi's Tutelage in your opening pack, you took it over a lot of cards. And in the end, I think it was more like a B. Next, I want to look at Archfiends Vessel. I gave this a straight up D. I just didn't think you'd be reanimating often enough for that demon thing to matter. And I didn't think it having lifelink would matter very much either because it's only a 1/1. And I think I was partly right. I don't think you generally wanted to play this in your typical limited deck. However, blue-black decks in this format were legitimate reanimation decks, and Rise Again being at common made it so you actually do end up playing Archfiends Vessel in that deck. It's not like your ideal thing to reanimate frequently, but it is a good thing to reanimate, obviously enough. And I think it was a solid playable in those decks, so I think it deserved more of a build-around grade. It's a C in the blue-black deck, and probably a D or an F everywhere else. So next up, it's Bad Deal. You may have noticed so far that all the cards I was wrong about, I underrated, and that is typically what happens. However, I do have a few cards I overrate in each set, and Bad Deal was that for me this time around. I liked the look of this. I like long, grindy, limited games, and I thought this seemed pretty sweet, paying 6 mana, making your opponent lose 2 cards, you drawing 2 cards, and them losing 2 life. And I rationalized it being a C+ because we have, obviously, discard effects aren't amazing most of the time, but I liked that this one, in an ideal situation, is giving you potentially a 4-for-1, or 3-for-1 at least, And even if your opponent has no cards in their hand, you do still get a small effect out of it. And usually when we see discard spells where that's the case, they're playable. But I think this one just ended up being too expensive for this format, because this format ended up being reasonably fast, and tapping out to cast Bad Deal was usually a good way to die. And in the end, I think this was a D. You don't play it most of the time. And yeah, that's the card I overrated in this set rather than underrated. Next up, it's Blood Glutton. I gave it a D+ in your typical deck and a C in the life gain deck. I didn't like the stats on it a whole lot. Lifelink is nice, and it was one of the few ways to do life gain repeatedly, and I knew that would be useful in the black-white deck. But it generally turned out that this was good enough in any deck, not just a black-white deck. I mean, making it evasive in various ways and making sure it hits your opponent once or twice is a huge deal, because as always, lifelink makes it very hard for your opponent to race. Using it to trade with an opposing creature while gaining you life can actually stabilize you. It's not a great card by any stretch, but I ended up playing it more than I thought I would, and I think it's just a C in every deck. Next up, it's Crypt Lurker, which I gave a C- to. So this ended up being significantly better than a C- in the end. It helped set up the blue-black Reanimator deck for one thing, and that certainly made it better. It also turned out that a 3/4 stat line lined up pretty well in this set. And, you frequently had something you wanted to sacrifice or discard when you played it, whether it had an aura on it, whether it's insignificant, whether you're not going to be able to cast it forever, whether you're going to rise again on it the next turn, things like that. So this ended up being more than just sort of barely filler. It ended up being a card that I found myself playing 2 or 3 copies of in the right deck, and it was a playable in just about any deck. I'm giving it a C+ in retrospect. Next up, it is Malefic Scythe. I gave it a C+. I knew it would be good equipment. The fact that it just continues to grow was awesome to me, but I underestimated just how good that was. I mean, it turns out that Malefic Scythe just snowballs value all game long and gets to the point where you can equip it for 1 mana to make basically any creature you have into a threat. I mean, even if it's just giving +3/+3, that's a lot in limited, and a pretty good deal for the mana investment. Over the course of the game, you got a lot more than, however much mana you spent on Malefic Scythe, you got more value than that out of it just about every time. And this ended up being one of the better common or uncommon equipment we've seen in a long time, and it was certainly first pickable, really easily first pickable, right around the same level as premium removal. I gave it a B in retrospect. Next up, I have Witch's Cauldron, and believe it or not, this is another card that I think I overrated. I gave it a C+. In the end, when I tried to play this card, it just didn't seem like situations presented themselves where I could really utilize it. It seems like a powerful effect to pay 2 mana, sack a creature, and do all of that. And there was a sacrifice deck in this format, but as it frequently does, it kind of disappointed in the long run, and that made it harder for this to really work out. I mean, I don't think it's terrible or anything, but I do think it's more of a build-around card, one that you really only played if you had a lot of good sacrifice fodder and sacrifice payoffs, rather than a card, a C+ straight up just means that basically any deck would play it, and that's what I thought. But I think in the end, it needed a build-around grade, and even in the ideal deck, I don't think it's that great. So I think it's a D in your typical limited deck, and a C in a deck that can really abuse Witch's Cauldron. All right, the last card I want to revisit is Chrome Replicator. It's a card I gave a D to. I just didn't think it would be that easy to make its ability trigger, so I thought it was effectively a 5 mana 4/4 with a tiny bit of upside. However, there ended up being a few things going on in this set that made it better than that. One of these is that the red-green deck was pretty powerful in this set, and 4 power on anything was pretty nice. So if you were in that deck, you sometimes played this, especially if you had a couple of copies of creatures, different creatures. And it also just turned out that more frequently than I expected, you're able to trigger its ability. It doesn't always happen, mind you, but if you have 3 or 4 creatures that you have doubles of, which happened reasonably often to me, I feel like, about half the time you would find this being a 5 mana 4/4 that makes another 4/4. And obviously, if that's what it always did, it would be like a B+ or an A-. It also wasn't really the worst reanimation target if your deck had duplicates. You could get it in your graveyard early, reanimate it, and only reanimate it in an ideal situation where you get that other 4/4. So overall, I think this comes out to a C. It was playable in a deck, especially a red-green deck that just had a couple of copies of 2 different creatures, and in any deck that has a couple of copies of more than 2 creatures, it ended up being a solid playable. So I'm going to give it a C overall in retrospect. Well, those are all the cards that I wanted to revisit in Core Set 2021. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like it and share it so that others can enjoy it too. If you want to make sure you catch future content of mine, including draft videos and set reviews, Don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications. Thanks for watching.